Imagine if each morning when you wake up, you're smiling and looking forward to your day, knowing you are happy even while you're dealing with grief and loss. The Grief and Happiness podcast inspires, comforts, and supports you with each new episode. I'm Emily Zerothret, welcoming you to explore with me your life of endless possibilities. Aloha. I am happy to have for my guest today, B.B. Wood, Barbara, and she's going to tell us about her book, The Violent Years, that she wrote. And I'm very happy to talk to you today, Barbara. Could you tell us a little bit about you?
Well, I was born and raised in West Virginia, went to school there as well, got married and ended up living in Europe for 10 years where I had my children. One in Germany and one in Spain. And then I came back to the States and where I became a teacher, and I did very well. I was very successful as a teacher until I got Parkinson's disease. And once I had that, I was beginning to lose my ability to write. It affected mostly my right hand. And eventually I had to quit teaching. So I had two big stresses to deal with. At that time. But at the time when I finally retired, which was in March of 2015, that month also my father died. And I had a lot to deal with. I was extremely ill at the time, but I soon recovered and I began drawing. I had actually started drawing while I was still teaching. And then after about a year or two of drawing, and I did really well. And a lot of my artwork is on my author page. There are links to that as well. But after a while, I started writing books, and I didn't intend to write books. I was just kind of thinking about stuff and starting to write it down. I was, wait a minute, I have a book here. And I wrote 3 novels before this book about my father came up. And the way that it came about with my father is that in 1983, apparently, I had asked him to write about his life story. And in 1989, he actually did that. And he recorded 14 tapes.
Wow.
14 audio tapes. And I didn't get to hear them because at the time I was busy raising kids and starting a new career, my teaching career and all that. I was into science at that time. I'm always into science. And so I just simply forgot about it. But 2 years ago, my son was going through our closet and found the tapes. He says, what are these? And I said, oh, my goodness, I forgot all about this 40, 50 years ago. Anyway, we could listen to him because the technology was too old. But he said he would figure out how to get it translated, which he did. He gave to me, and he gave it to me for Christmas. And he said, Mom, you really need to listen to these. I think what is on here is pretty important. And indeed, he had addressed the tapes to me. And of the tapes, the last 8 were covering the years 1940 to 1950. And he called those the violent years. He named that. Not because people were being hurt or things were being damaged, but because of the tumultuous changes, the dramatic changes in fortune, both positive and negative, that were occurring to him during that time. And at the end of the tapes, which ended in 1950, he said, and so my daughter Barbara was born, so ending the violent years. And I knew that I had to write his story. When I did this, I started off using the transcripts from the tapes. That's where I wanted to start. And I knew I wanted to focus on just that decade, although he had 6 other tapes of the rest of his life, which I also listened to. I wanted to focus on that because it was very specific. But I realized right away that I was going to have a difficult time because, 2 things. One is the way that he spoke. His thoughts were very organized and clear, but he spoke in a very folksy sort of manner, which is very easy to listen to, but terrible when you try to transcribe it. It looks awful on the printed page. And furthermore, he was talking about a lot of things that the reader wouldn't know what he was talking about, people and places and such. So I realized I needed 2 stories here. One, his first person account, which are the actual transcripts from his tapes for those 8 tapes. And the other is a second storyline alternating between those other chapters with a third person narration to contrast his first person, telling about his life growing up and what it was like and what happened to him, so that the reader would understand what was going on. And these two stories are intertwined. Anyway, so that gets you pretty much up to where I wrote the book. Now, obviously, I was under a lot of stress there, but, and COVID hit in the middle of this.
Oh, gee.
Now, my father had died in 2015, so he was not around for me to talk to about this book. My mother still is. She's 97 now, and she's very sharp, very mobile. And I was able to go through this with her, which was important because she was stuck in a nursing home when I first got this. It's now an assisted living. And she had never heard the tapes.
Mm.
She had never heard some of these stories. She had never heard. And so I went through those with her. We're talking on the phone, and I would type up stuff, and the secretary would, because they were confined, and they were quarantined a lot of this time, and the secretary would send printed pages under the door so my mother could read them, and then we would talk about all the things that were going on, and she added a lot of context and explanation to these particular stories. And I think it was a very important thing for all of us to deal with, not only COVID, but the death of my father, the whole family.
And, this is just fascinating to me, especially because those years between 1940 and 1950 were very significant for my family. My mom and dad were recently married, and they had my sister, and there was the three of them. And they assumed that dad wouldn't be drafted because he was married and because he had a baby. And the first people they drafted weren't married and didn't have babies. Then they started doing people who were married but didn't have children. And then it got to the point where they were drafting people who were married and had children. And so he ended up going into the Army. And he spent the rest of his life as an advocate for veterans and did a lot of wonderful work for that. But I never could get anything out of him about what happened. And
right.
Yeah, I always wondered what shaped their lives during that time. And with mom wouldn't talk about it either, because I could just imagine in those days being all of a sudden alone with the baby and not knowing where her husband was or what he was doing or if he was safe. And
well, my father's story for the war years, that's really what it was about. As a matter of fact, the book starts with him sitting in a boat waiting to land at Normandy. And so he came ashore there in the second wave and fought for a couple of months, and then he was captured. And they sent him to a German prisoner of war camp, actually two different ones. And then he escaped from the prisoner of war camp, made his way to Poland, and finally got back in a very dramatic reunion with the family because they had heard he was missing in action and nothing else after that. They didn't know he was alive. And he was one of the first guys to come back. And then right away, he started training for the Olympics. And in 1948, he represented Penn State on the United States men's gymnastics team. Like I said, in 1948. And in the middle of this, of course, he had everything going on with my mother. And my father was, it turned out, a prolific writer, which I did not know about when I heard these tapes. And I asked my mother a question about something. She said, well, it's in the letters. And I said, what letters? She says, I have lots of letters. How many? 400? I mean, he wrote every day. He wrote all the time. And he also had poetry. He wrote her lovely poetry for her birthday. They met when he was 16 and she was 14 at a dance. It was quite a dramatic meeting because she said that he was walking down. She was with another date waiting for a dance to start. No one was there yet. And she could hear somebody walking down this long hallway whistling American Patrol, which is a patriotic song. And she said, she had no idea who was coming down that hall, but she knew that whoever walked through that door, she was going to marry.
Wow.
He knew. And when he walked in and turned around, she said, time stopped. Time stopped. She doesn't remember anything else about the rest of the night, except that that night when she came home to see her mother, she said, "I met the man I'm going to marry tonight." Of course, that was my father. So and so he wrote her lots of poetry, and I didn't know anything about all these letters. So suddenly I hear I'm with all these tapes and everything. Now I've got my sister who apparently was keeping them. And so she sent copies of everything to me so that I could then fill out and find out the rest of the story that was going on with that. It was quite an eye-opener for my family because we solved a lot of mysteries about things we didn't understand why. But once we got the letters and the tapes and everything together, then everything started to make sense. But those were the years that he talked about from 1940 to 1950, where was the war and the Olympics, and then eventually moving to West Virginia, where I'm from, and settling in there.
Wow. That's just incredible story. I love it. It's amazing how much was written down at that time with different letters and things that went back and forth. I couldn't find anything like that about my parents. I was hoping that they had written to each other at some point, and I think they did. And they probably just didn't leave anything where anybody else could read it.
Well, it probably we had a lot of those, I think, as well. We found a couple of small notes up in my attic, and I don't know how they got up there, but they were little teeny notes that he had written to her in 1941. And anyway, when he returned from the war, it was very dramatic because she got a phone call from his sister saying, "He's back, he's here, and he's walking to your house. He'll be there in 2 minutes."
Wow.
That's from thinking he'd been dead for almost a year.
Oh, wow.
And all of a sudden he's walking up, and she stood out front, and she said she could see him just coming up there looking like he always did, just all spit and polish and marching right up to him, just purposely, very determined. And he came up to the steps and just grabbed her and just gave her the best kiss she'd ever had in her entire life.
Wow.
Yeah, there were a lot of great stories in the book.
Oh, yeah, that's so romantic. How wonderful.
Yeah. A lot of good romance in this book.
Oh, that's great.
There's a lot of sad stories in there too, but there are a lot of really good ones.
What's your favorite story?
My favorite story is when he was the head cheerleader at Penn State University. It was 1948. He had just come back from the Olympics, so he was what you call a big man on campus, BMOC. And like I said, he was the head cheerleader before he was in the Olympics. And before the war, he had, as soon as he came back from the war, there were lots of GIs coming back. They were all flooding the campuses, especially Penn State, and they had nowhere to put all these guys. And some of them had families and everything else, and it was very hard finding housing. So they had classes, where to put all the people in classes. So they had a whole bunch of satellite campuses all around the state, near State College, where Penn State is. And he was just a regular cheerleader then, just before the Olympics. And what he did, because they were all GIs, and he was a GI, he went around to every single one of these campuses, every one of them, and he taught them all the cheers. Wow. And he taught them how he went, so that when they would come to the football games, they knew what was going on. But the thing is, they all knew him personally. And when two things happened with that, one is when he was trying out for the Olympics, they thought all these other guys were going to get it first. We were going to be getting on. And when they called out his name pretty early, the place went nuts for him because they knew him personally. But later on, and then when he was in the Olympics, of course, then everybody knew him. He was all kind of clubs and such. But what he was able to do at the football games, he knew of course, they had the mascot, the Nittany Lion. And he did a lot of funny things with the Nittany Lion. But he and my mother also were the ones that came up with cards. They got 1 foot square cards, blue on one side, white on the other, and all had a code and a seat number on these cards. Hundreds and hundreds of them. And every game, they would take them out with the cheerleaders, and they would put all these cards in the proper places on the seats. And when my father would yell, code 53, then people look at their card and they would turn either the blue or the white card, depending on what the code was. And it would spell out stuff, and because people were holding up these cards. And they would spell out, go Penn State or defense or whatever they needed, because that was, of course, before computers and all that kind of thing. But the thing that was, to me, was the funniest thing that he did. And we had skits that he did with the Nittany Lion. But during the game, periodically, he would lead a cheer and he would stop in the middle of the cheer, just stop. For instance, one cheer that I found that actually was a real cheer was called Nittany Lions. And what he would do is he would use the megaphone and he'd yell, and then he'd take his fist and shoot it up into the air. And as soon as he did that, the entire crowd would go, N. And then he'd go, I. And he'd raise his hand and they'd all go, I. And then he'd say, double T, A. And then he didn't raise his hand. And the place was silent. Nobody messed this up. And he'd say, A, but he didn't raise his fist. And he'd go, sit down. This is in the middle of a football game. He'd sit down. And he'd be over there for quite a while, apparently. And then he would finally find a break, or was the end of timeout or whatever it was. He'd get back on and he'd just put his fist up in the air and they'd all go, A. And then he'd do N, Y, roar, Nittany Lions, roar, or something like that at the end. But he was able to completely control the entire stadium just with his motions.
Wow.
Because they all knew him. And I had so much fun writing that chapter. There were other chapters that were really funny too, but that one just kind of captured my imagination.
That is so cool. I just love that. Often we don't think of our parents as energetic younger people. Yeah. So that's just wonderful. I really like that. Was he, before he went off to war, was he interested in gymnastics? Yes, he actually started that very little. His mother died when he was quite young, and he lost his brother as well. But those were a little bit later. But it was the Depression, and they had nothing. And there were 5 kids. And the only thing that he could do is his sisters would take him to the YMCA, where he learned to swim and dive. He was a superb swimmer and diver as well. And gymnastics, he started then. But he really got into it when he got to high school. And he had a coach, Paul Keebler. And Paul Keebler kind of took over for his father, because his father was just barely making ends meet. The mother was gone. He was the youngest of 6. And the other siblings were on their way, or they were gone. And so he was kind of left to himself, and he became actually kind of a neighborhood hoodlum. At the time, he got into a lot of trouble for a lot of things. And some of those stories are in there, just crashing. And they would used to play cops and robbers with his buddies. They had these cap pistols, they would just make a little pop sound. And they would run all through the neighborhood. And by running through the neighborhood, this was Philadelphia, in the row houses in the slums of Philadelphia. And when I say run through the house, I mean they ran through the houses. I mean, they'd run through the living room and then, jump out in the porch. Other people's house, they didn't know. And they'd run across the rooftops. And one time he crashed into this, what's called an aerial. It's a big wire that's suspended on huge poles on top of the houses. And the whole thing fell down and fell down in between houses and broke away. It just made a mess. And of course, they scattered because they knew the police were coming. So my father nonchalantly walked back to the house, hoping they wouldn't notice that he was not there. And as soon as he walked near the house, there was a whole bunch of people, and the cop car was sitting out in front. And they all yelled, "There he is! There's a hoodlum! There's the guy!" And they said, "Did you do it?" He said, "Yeah, I did." So they threw him in the cop car, the police. And they ran him around for about 10, 15 minutes, telling that this was dangerous, that he could have injured people and so on. And he said, "Yes, sir." And they took him back to the house, and he went in and he waited for his father. And his father said nothing to him, nothing. But then he and the older brother got tools and materials, which were hard to get. And they took the time and the money and went back up there
and repaired everything. And my father said there was nothing that they could have done that would have crushed him more than that. And so there was a lot of stories like that. But Paul Keebler was the one that got him really going in gymnastics, actually saved him when he came back from the war because he had a lot of guilt about surviving. And his coach helped him with that renewal after the war. So gymnastics was a really important part of his life. And it was a lot of fun as a dad because we used to, he'd flip us around and, we were always doing all kind of crazy things around the house or at the beach.
That sounds like so much fun.
It was.
Finding all these things, I'm sure, is what inspired you to write the book. And as you said, you had Parkinson's. And was that a challenge to be able to write with your Parkinson's?
Absolutely. Because one of the reasons I had to stop was because I couldn't write with my right hand. So cannot type. I couldn't type really very well to begin with, but now I'm down to one finger with my left hand. All my books were written, and this book was written one finger, left hand.
Wow.
Over and over again. And I tried doing, one of those things where you can just talk and it will transcribe. No, it was worse. It was worse. I had to make so many corrections. I just finally gave up on that, but that was quite difficult. And the thing that was interesting to me, and that threw off my neurology guy, my Parkinson's doctor, was that I was a science person. And as I lost the ability from my right hand, I do all my typing and everything with now my left hand. I switched sides. And when I switched one side of the brain from the science, I switched over to the arts at the same time that I did that. And so he was quite amazed to watch me do all this drawing, first of all, with my left hand, and then typing all these books with my left hand as well.
Wow, that's amazing. I know with my grief, one of the things that I started doing was drawing, and I never thought that I could draw. I had done preliminary things when I was working in theater and had to get sketches for things, but that's as far as I went, and that had convinced me that I could not draw. So I found it hard enough to learn how to draw with my right hand, which is my dominant hand. I can't imagine trying to do it with my left hand.
Well, I didn't think I could do it either. Apparently I could. Can't draw with my right hand, but I can draw with my left hand. I can do signatures because I have medication now. And so when it wears off, you can tell I have Parkinson's because I get tremors in my right hand still. But that was 13 years ago when I got Parkinson's. Wow. So it's been quite the journey. And they say that, when one door closes, another door opens. And that was definitely the case for me. And being able to write these books. One thing I realized with my book, with this book, both my sister and my brother got these tapes at the same time I did. They listened to them back then. And they did not act on them. And I realized if I had read them back then, I would have not acted on them either, because I wasn't in a point in my life where it was important to do this. And when I listened to the tapes, it almost felt like I was called. So probably the best way to describe it. This is something I had to do, that people needed to know about this. My mother told me that she couldn't figure out why she was living so long. She's almost 98 now. She's 97. And she said, I realize now that I lived this long so I could help you with this book.
Wow. Wow. That is amazing. I'm so happy you shared your story with us, because a lot of times when somebody dies, people don't know what to do. They feel like they need to do something, or there's something that could help them with moving forward, but they don't know what it is. And you sure found what helped you, and to bring this gift to you, with being able to accomplish all this, as well as the gift to the world to be able to hear this story, because it's quite a wonderful story.
Yeah, they always talk about the greatest generation. And I was thinking, my father isn't extraordinary, but he's an ordinary representative of the greatest generation. And what a gift that he gave me and maybe others as well by taking the time to record those wonderful, wonderful tapes.
That's so great. I'm all about writing, and I help people learn how they can write to help them with their grief all the time. And this is a wonderful example of it. It doesn't mean you ever had to be a writer. You can just write in your journal and write someplace. But the writing, wouldn't you say it helped you with dealing with your Parkinson's and with your memories of your dad?
Well, I think in a lot of ways that the dealing with those situations allowed me to write this particular book rather than the book helped me deal, because it actually occurred a couple of years afterward. But it's like a meant to be kind of thing, because if I hadn't gone through all of that, and my father's death actually was a very peaceful death, and it's in the book. I did put that at the end in an epilogue. It was a very peaceful situation, and so there wasn't a lot of turmoil with that. So many other things do have turmoil associated with them. But by going through all those things before I heard the tapes allowed me to bring them to life for other people, I think, in a way that if I had listened to them in 1989, would have never happened.
Yeah. Wow. That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm sure people are going to be fascinated by getting their hands on this book. That's something that will be inspirational, not only because of the story that you tell in the book, but of your story and your writing of it under these circumstances. I think is quite amazing. So thank you so much for joining me today.
And the book is available on Amazon now, along with my other books as well.
That's great.
I hope they enjoy it, reading it as much as I enjoyed writing it.
Oh, I'm sure they will. And I will put in the show notes the links so that you can easily find this, because you'll want to get a copy. So
thank you.
Oh, and thank you for joining me today. I'm so glad you came. And to my listeners, oh, you're welcome. My listeners, I'm looking forward to seeing you again next week, and we'll have more fascinating things to talk about at that time. Aloha. Do you want more comfort, support, and happipiness? Join the Grief and Happiness Alliance. Visit my website at lovingandlivingyourwaythroughgrief.com and read my book, Loving and Living Your Way Through Grief. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast, rate it, review it, and binge on all our episodes on grief and happiness. I can't wait to welcome you back to another episode